Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As we welcome you once again to the Wednesday night edition of Wednesday Night with myself, Inayet Wadee. Wonderful being with you as we welcome our listeners, our viewers at Salam Media on the various platforms this evening. Great being with you as always as we look at issues. We take them apart. We have a detailed discussion. We invite panelists to join us in the discussion. Now, tonight we are looking at two issues. One being the up and coming BRICS summit, and that will take place from now right until 8 p.m. and at around from now until 8 p.m. Yes, and thereafter, right until 9 p.m., we will be looking at the relationship between Israel and India and how this has evolved over a period of time. What does it mean for minorities both in India and in Palestine? And that will take us through right until 9 p.m. But right now, we are talking about the up and coming BRICS summit, a summit that will be held on the 23rd and the 24th of June. It is going to be a virtual summit, so the leaders will not be meeting. It will be chaired by the president of the Republic of China, and also looking at some of the other partners, BRICS made up of South Africa, India, Brazil, and Russia. Now, together, this is quite interesting. They all represent 41% of the world's population. And looking at what BRICS has achieved over a period of time, and also in terms of what we can expect coming through in during this summit, considering the fact that it does come against the background of Russia and its involvement in the Ukraine, with the entire world obviously against Russia, and of large parts of the world against Russia. So I'm sure this is going to be a summit with a difference, considering the economic impact, the global consequences for the world economy as a result of the Russian involvement in the Ukraine. Now, looking at our panelists this evening, we are going to be joined shortly by Ashraf Patel, and we also have got Katembo Nixon Tasakana will be joining us, and hopefully we will be getting hold of Gideon Chitenga in a few minutes as well. I see my guests are on screen right now. Ashraf, we welcome you to the show. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam, Brother Inayet and Nixon. Hope you're all well on this cold evening.
Yes, Nixon, great that you're able to join us as well. We welcome you to the show. We appreciate you taking time out and joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me on your show, and assalamu alaikum to your viewers and the listeners at home. Inshallah, I hope the discussions are going to go very well. And Ashraf, thank you for the greetings.
Well, inshallah, we certainly hope so, Nixon. Now, Ashraf, when we're looking at this year's BRICS summit, and I mentioned that it is going to be a summit with a difference. We know there has been huge controversy, there has been huge concerns, particularly surrounding the countries that have not gone against the likes of Russia with the latest developments that have been taking place in the Ukraine. And looking at BRICS and looking at the BRICS countries. And I think just before we get to that, perhaps we need to just look at Russia in itself and to unpack the state of the current geopolitical tensions as a result of the war.
Yes, thank you for that introduction, Inayet. Very useful. I think, the world economy is facing several very challenging headwinds at a structural level. The global economy has just slowly come out of the 2 years of the COVID pandemic, with many nations in their GDPs that have been cut by between 7 and 10%. And the developing world, the developing South and Africa in particular, have suffered the triple burdens of poverty, of inequality, and then the specter of the vaccine nationalism, where many nations in Africa have not received affordable vaccines. Now, just coming out of that, we enter February 2022, And then you have the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And that has basically amplified all these existing challenges and headwinds in the global economy. And of course, there have been many webinars and analysis every day since the Russian-Ukraine conflict, and naturally, it's polarized. I mean, there's no doubt that you are beginning to see the new kind of divisions along the old, let's say, Cold War lines, and you're beginning to see whereas we were on a trajectory of a multipolar world, and multilateralism was the key underpinning in terms of what the BRICS was all about. So within the current milieu, what we are having and what we do see is a fracturing of an international consensus. And both sides, on the one hand, of course, Russia, which represents a very much East Eurasian world centered, let's say, around the Russia, China, Eurasian world, and large parts of the developing South. And then you also have the Ukraine and the new countries that have entered the EU in the last 25 years, who see themselves as part of the West. And within that nation state of the Ukraine, it's not an easy East-West division, because you're having both Russian-speaking population, about 40%, 45%, and very much Western-looking urban-centric population centered around the Kievs. And so you see this clash of not just ideology or geopolitics, because, of course, the trigger for these invasion or operation was essentially, we all know, the narrative around NATO, around Ukraine joining NATO, the EU, and then on the other hand, Russian concerns around those kind of encroachment. And both sides are at a very critical juncture, in a sense that the conflict is now a global conflict, because when the price of fuel escalates, as it has been 35% in the last 3 months, and the price of food and wheat and sunflower oil, etc., it means that that conflict affects us, ordinary citizens, globally, and especially in the developing world, where many nations and peoples of Africa and the developing world are suffering. And so this is where we are. It is very, very complicated. There's no easy answers. And, I would say that as peace-loving citizens, we subscribe to the UN charters, we subscribe to the AU charters. We should all try and find a peaceful, sustainable kind of solution to this crisis. But yes, this is the current situation that I see. Yes.
Yes. Now, Nixon, we know that from tomorrow and on Friday, the 23rd and the 24th, the next BRICS Summit for 2022 will be held. And as I alluded to in my introduction, BRICS does represent a substantial grouping of players. We're talking about 5 countries. The statistics are clear. We're talking about 40% of the world population. We talk about 26% of the planet's land across these 4 continents. We're talking of 25% of global GDP. We're talking of 20% of world trade. And this is despite the conflict that Russia and the involved in, despite we've seen the consequences for Russia and the reaction of the entire global world. One cannot ignore BRICS because it is extremely significant.
I think let me take the cue from my predecessor, Ashraf. Yes. I don't know if you can get me there.
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yes, I think let me take a cue from my predecessor, Ashraf, my fellow interlocutor on the show, is that what we see currently, we have to draw to particular things. One is the redrawal of the economic architecture of the world economy. And the second point is as well as the political architecture of the world, the way we used to know it, where there's certain dominant power over the other who want to impose themselves. And in this particular, we go back to what Ashraf mentions as East versus West. In this case, Russia and China, and on the other hand, the EU and the United States. In this case, NATO as a whole, which is kind of fighting a proxy war in Ukraine, in as much as Ashraf talked about issues of concerns by Russia within Ukraine approaching NATO and the EU membership. The third point I want to draw to our attention is the
Nixon,
issue
I
of...
think we are having a problem. Obviously, you seem to be breaking up. We're going to try and see if we can't get you a better line.
Yes, certainly. I don't know if you can still get me there. Can you hear me?
Yes. I can hear you, yes.
I can hear you as well, but it's on the hot side, I think.
I think it's a studio. Probably Inayet is redialing. I think so, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Nixon, you may continue.
Okay.
Yes, and I was mentioning the first point being the redraw of the global political architecture that we know it, and the second being the security architecture that we know around the issue of Ukraine, as Ashraf mentioned in his submissions. But the third one, which is around the issue of the rule-based international system, which seems to be coming at play here, where in most cases it has been issues of mighty makes it right. And we see that playing on both sides, where the United States and its ally under NATO, as well as Ukraine, in this case, is asking for membership of the European Union. While on the other hand, Russia demanding that it should not be an issue that threatens its security on its border. And I think that's quite very significant in a sense that going toward this BRICS summit that is happening now, you have to understand that those issues are going to come into play in going to this discussion, especially if you want to mention the context of the current sanction on Russia, and then you would have seen it, the West, mainly European countries going around the world, kind of doing shuttle diplomacy in dictating to other countries what they should do in relation to the conflict in Ukraine between Russia and the Ukrainian state. So I think for the definition of that, we need to look at the context in which economically where BRICS comes in. You mentioned some statistics there, which are quite very interesting in where this relationship and the discussions are going to happen at BRICS. You would recall that both BRICS countries have refused actually to sign to sign to this UN narrative of wholesale condemnation of Russia. That tells you, Matt, that they do not agree of what is happening in Ukraine, in as much as they do not agree with what is happening with the narrative that the West and the broader NATO, this case led by the United States, is driving. And I think for BRICS happening at this particular juncture, then it tells us on what is going to happen going forward, and how the world economy is going to be drawn in a light of the Russia sanction. Already there are discussions within China of a possible alternative to this economic system in terms of economic transaction and how banks transact with each other after Russia was kicked out of SWIFT. And if you follow policymakers both in the United States and in Europe, there seems to be targeting Russia, but in actual sense, China seems to be the next target in terms of economic embargo and the way they have been dealing with China on economic policy issues. So BRICS summit happening in this context, and South Africa taking a back foot in terms of the Ukrainian conflict, it underlies again the point I'm trying to underscore here about the changing world economy architecture in terms of how these countries relate to each other, to sort of the kind of a paternalistic approach to world economy that have been driven mostly by the West under the Bretton Woods institutions, namely the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, which organization are most controlled by these Western countries. So if these statistics that you've mentioned that have going to have any meaning in terms of the discussions, and I think that have to be factored in going forward. And for me, it's looking at the relationship between China and Russia at this critical juncture, but also one need to not forget about the Indian position in the conflict. You know that India has been buying more oil from Russia, despite a call from the United States and the EU trying to persuade India otherwise. On the other hand, you have Brazil, which is led by more right-wing leadership under Jair Bolsonaro, not also saying that much about its relationship with Russia in the light of what is happening in Ukraine. So that it tells you how much really what are the issues at hand going towards this BRICS summit, and whether they are going to form a serious coherent bloc that rivals what we know now as the Bretton Woods institution, namely the World Bank and the IMF. And you know that for some few years ago, there was the creation of the BRICS Development Bank, of which South Africa was a part of. You know, the Nana, the Ntanda Saga, who was said to have been appointed to go lead that particular institution, something that have never happened. So it's very important to look at those issues in context. But on a security aspect, though, we need to look at what is happening between China and Taiwan, in as much as what is happening with Ukraine and Russia, and the response by the United States that is going to protect Taiwan, whereas Taiwan is considered by China as its own part of region. And history tells us really that this Taiwan broke away after the 1949 revolution when Chiang Kai-shek ran to Taiwan and formed a rival government to that of Peking at the time, which is Beijing now as we know it today. So those are going to form part of the discussions in going towards this BRICS summit. The whole issue of the economy, the whole issue of world security, and the whole issue of multilateralism, whether they still have relevance in the current context, and whether the narrative that is driven by, namely, the United States and its ally in NATO and the European countries, is one that should dictate the world as we know it today. So that is very important. You recall that there is that holy alliance of Western countries against either China or either Russia. On the other hand, South Africa being in the middle but having a serious trading relationship between China and Russia, but also on historical relations. You know for the fact that Russia helped this country so much in terms of its own liberation, supplying training facilities and education for armed combatants who were fighting the apartheid government at the time. And this is a moral kind of approach and question that South Africa bear with when to look at its relationship with Russia. So that is in essence what drives this meeting going forward, and it will be interesting to see how the discussions unfold in the summit.
Yes, thank you for that, Nixon. Now, Ashraf, when one looks at the BRICS and when one looks at the establishment of BRICS, it was a forum that was established by like-minded emerging market developing countries, and they made certain commitments. Some of those commitments included restructuring the global political, economic, and financial architecture to be more inclusive, to be fair, to be representative, and also at the same time looking at the participation of developing countries. Now, this is very, very significant in a sense that when one looks at what some of these objectives actually mean, and perhaps if you could even unpack the impact of BRICS on developing countries.
Thank you, Inayet. Thank you, Nixon. That was very well articulated. Overall, I think you're correct. The BRICS bloc was formed in 2009 with the objective essentially to deepen development in global multilateral institutions. And of course, as we know, just last week or over the weekend, the World Trade Organization, WTO, had its ministerial conference after 4 years. And it was meant to be one of the most important package of agreements that were meant to be signed. There was a lot of activity before, months and months of activity by many nations in the developing South to argue for a better trade deal in all the sectors. So we're looking at the agricultural agreement, the fisheries agreement, the IP waiver for COVID vaccines, getting patents, a more fair patent system so the developing nations can manufacture their own vaccines, etc., etc. But as you know, there was a huge push by the northern nations, especially the US, the EU, Australia, Canada, etc., to block a lot of the developmental components. And so what you saw is just very much a watered down agreements on the key issues, especially agriculture. We're in an era where food security is the number one challenge facing most of the poorer nations in the world and in Africa. And even there, the WTO could not agree on the mechanism of subsidy, food banks, seed banks, etc. And yet, those very nations, especially the EU, the US, Australia, and Canada, their subsidies to their farmers is on average of $40,000 per farmer per year. and that is why they have surplus agricultural goods where they can feed their own nations, but also then therefore dump excess capacity or produce in the world markets, thereby distorting world markets. So that is one example of the unethical conduct of northern nations, especially the EU and the US and Australia. Purely, if you just look at agriculture, that is one example. Now, where does BRICS fit in? I mean, both all the BRICS nations were supportive of the position of the G77, which was the global south. On the position of vaccines, for instance, at the WTO over the weekend, as you know, the issue of the intellectual property, the IP waiver for vaccines, was sponsored by India and South Africa and several other nations. 60 nations signed on it, but at the end, the power structure of the WTO, the EU and the US especially, managed to water down the entire intellectual property waiver, which meant that the intellectual property and patents will still be vested by the pharmaceutical corporations. We all know that the South African vaccine rollout has been a disaster. It has been expensive. It has been wasteful, etc., etc. And many nations in Africa are in the worst position. Then there were the fisheries treaty. What kind of global fishing and sustainability system we need? And this is vital. It all links to the UN COP26 process, sustainable development, overfishing the oceans, in an era where the world population is now 7 billion. I mean, that's massive. 20 years ago, it was 5 billion. So the entire system, the ecosystem of the earth is constrained. And this is where BRICS plays a fundamental role. And it can come up with the solutions, the technologies that are accessible, that are cheaper, so that smaller nations and small and medium enterprises can access these kind of technologies so that we can produce a cheaper food, medicine, education for the masses. And I think that is the real value of the BRICS at an economic level and a social level and a people-to-people level. So it has phenomenal opportunity and phenomenal potential, because it's not just about the 5 BRICS nations, it's also about the BRICS Plus. So if you take Africa, for instance, although South Africa is a member of BRICS and the G20, the BRICS nations also outreach to other nations, whether it's Zambia or Kenya or Nigeria or Egypt, etc. Tanzania, for instance. These are nations that benefit significantly from many of the BRICS nations, especially the Chinese infrastructure or medicines, etc., etc. So it's not just about South Africa. South Africa has a responsibility to ensure such benefits flow into the region. So it's not, there is some debate whether it is South Africa is playing a gatekeeping role, and in some cases it may be so, but overall I know the intention. If you read the documents very carefully, the intention definitely is we should deepen multilateralism. And believe you me, if you look at all the communiques of the BRICS summits over the years, you look at the formation, the founding documents, the programs, they all talk to the United Nations system. So it's all about strengthening the UN system, strengthening multilateralism, strengthening access to medication, dealing with the climate crisis, dealing with financial reforms. And as we speak, I can tell you that the most of the global economy is facing the phenomena of what is called recession, inflation, and stagflation. Now, if you were to read extensively, you'd see that even within Europe as we speak, in the last few days, ordinary citizens are taking to the streets, demanding that governments be more proactive in subsidizing a range of services, especially energy. fuel, food, transportation. The cost of living is unsustainable for a lot of the middle classes in the UK and Europe. Now, that signifies that the current model, especially of the UK, because they're on a very conservative neoliberal pathway under Prime Minister Johnson, ordinary citizens are on the streets. They haven't delivered cheap, affordable energy, fuel, food, and on top of that, they on this massive deregulation and privatization of services. So this contradiction is showing up. The same with France and other nations. So what BRICS offers in that domain, and especially I would say even within BRICS, it's actually China that is leading the way. You know, I would say all the other BRICS nations are fairly small. Russia and Brazil are medium economies, and then South Africa is a small economy. So the Chinese model, as economists are calling it, is beginning to gain traction purely and especially in the COVID era, post-COVID era, because the prudent management, their model, which is a very much state-centric, socialist, capitalist, hybrid model, but they manage it very, very effectively and competently and scientifically, and they apply the best technology and human resources and capability. And as a result, today they are now an economic superpower. In many cases, their GDP is approaching that of the US. They even exceed large parts of the EU. So their model is increasingly being very, very attractive to many, many nations. Now, if you were a smaller country in Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, and you're looking at the development indicators, compare China and the US, for instance. In the US, what we're beginning to see over 35 years, the inequalities are deepening. So you have what is called the top 2%. They accrue 55% of income, national income, the most unequal in the world. Brazil as well, very unequal. Race relations at an all-time low. You saw the issues around access to health. At one stage, they had a Medicare plan that was championed by President Obama. It was fairly distributive, fairly equitable, but yet that entire health plan, which was so much needed by ordinary U.S. citizens, was diluted in Congress. And today, there's 60 million Americans that don't have access to basic health care. They have to go across the border to Canada or Mexico for medicines. They have the gun control issue. So the entire society is unraveling. And that model, which is called Anglo-Saxon capitalism, free market capitalism, for many years was marketed as the best, is no more that. So what you used to see on Hollywood and CNN and Fox as an image of America, that is unraveling rapidly. And as an alternative, China is offering something unique. And that is a new kind of civilization that is based on putting the human first, the meeting your human development indicators, like education, health, housing, water, the environment, living harmoniously. All of these are important platforms that has made the Chinese model successful, as well as the industrialization model. Even the political model is very socialist, and very difficult for other countries to emulate. But one can only see and admire that model for what it has achieved. So what you have unprecedented in world history, the Chinese model has basically provided all the services for its population. At least 350 million people over 30 years has moved out of poverty and into the middle class. And that is unprecedented in human history. Now, that is a model that offers a lot of potential for other nations, be it in Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, Middle East, North Africa. What we're saying is, as South Africa, we're playing some sort of middle role balancing act, and the world is diversifying. most of the trade that's going to take place in future or already taking place is the South Africa. China is the number one trading partner for South Africa, basically, followed by US and EU. So these trade investment patterns are shifting, and so it's only natural that formations such as BRICS gain more prominence, but also offers some kind of alternative. So I think that is where the debates are currently.
Yes, we thank you for that, Ashraf. And just getting to Nixon now. Nixon, I think Ashraf obviously has unpacked a lot, and obviously looking at the Chinese model, looking at China and its a superpower status, and what China can do for the rest of the world. And when one looks at the world in general, and looking at South Africa in particular, looking at where we have positioned ourselves. Now, we know for a long time that when you have organizations like the World Bank or the IMF, and once you become a slave of these institutions, we see it right across Africa. We see it even in this country as well, where basic services like health, like education, all of them have suffered as a result, and as a result of dictating by the likes of the IMF, the World Bank. A clear example has been what we've seen in Pakistan as well, where to a large extent the IMF has had a role in Pakistan, a democracy where we saw Imran Khan was removed. And also he again placed reliance on Russia. And you mentioned India as well, buying cheaper gas, cheaper oil from Russia. So as long as countries remain slaves to the likes of the IMF, to the World Bank, and don't consider alternatives like BRICS, for instance, we're still going to be in limbo.
Certainly, and I think this is where BRICS becomes very important in a way that what I often call in a formal discussion with my friends that stand up to economic bullies. In this case, IMF rules and World Bank conditionality being used as a yardstick actually to squeeze much of these other countries that come to the institution to borrow. And let us be very clear. You recall for the fact that there has been discussion about why developing countries have to borrow at a higher cost, interest costs at about 15% on average, whereas Western countries such as the United States and France and these European countries, including the United Kingdom, borrowing at an average 3%. And the question is that where is the balance in this approach to these institutions? And I think that now returns to the question of why the BRICS countries have established the banks such as the BRICS Development Bank in a way to bring a sort of equitable approach to world economy in terms of institutional framework when it comes to financing. So I think that is very important going towards this meeting, and especially with the way in which behaviors are emerging, sort of sidelining developing countries in terms of economic development, and as and when it suits to Western power, especially the Bretton Woods institutions, to dictate the terms, as you alluded, and therefore leading many people into poverty. And I think Ashraf quietly outlined the clear point about Chinese model, which actually, by the way, have lifted millions out of poverty. And there are greater lessons to learn from this. But what is striking at the moment, I think, is the way in which the very same Western institutions that have been established are being used actually to fight geopolitical and geoeconomic battles are in the world, and actually to sideline other countries regardless of their call for a more equitable and a more fair world. And I think if you want to look at all those issues, you have to understand that clearly what you have just said in the preamble of your question there, just see the necessity of these BRICS countries to come together and try to counter this kind of predatory approach from the other partners. And I remember President Vladimir Putin of Russia, he normally called them as Western friends. And that is the nature of diplomacy, but also international politics. You know, it is driven by interest. And if you want to take a look at a realist approach, you would recall that economic interests take precedence over political interest. But also those very same economic interests dictate how the security issues are going to be dealt with, as you see the war in Ukraine. And there were talk just recently about China also diversifying its economy in the light of what happened to Russia in terms of being cut off SWIFT. China also taking precautionary measures over the issues of Taiwan. So BRICS countries going into this meeting, those are major considerations also that are going to be taking a center stage on how the West have been using economic multilateral institutions actually to kind of oppress the development of developing countries. And I think BRICS as a forum becomes very critical in this case to counter what has been built over the years by Western powers to actually make sure that they contain the development. And unfortunately for Western countries, the talk has been kind of one of a belligerent approach in terms of world economy, kind of us versus them, instead of looking at cooperation, broader development, but also looking at uplifting the majority of the people from world poverty, instead of hoarding resources, as we have seen with even at the health front with the vaccine, as Ashraf mentioned earlier. And these are issues that need to be highlighted when having discussions of this nature, so that it just don't become a narrative about China is this or Russia is this. And you know that the media plays a central role in educating the masses about these issues, and in a way that the world economy as well as the geopolitics of the world has been run sort of this paternalistic approach by Western countries.
Well, thank you for that, Nixon. Ashraf, I think one of the key issues here is to look at the hypocrisy. And just to give an example, if we look at the world is right now in the middle of an energy crisis of mammoth proportions. And the same would go for the likes of the EU. We're looking at Britain. All of them are facing a crisis of some sort, whether we're talking about energy, we're talking about inflation, and also looking at the environment, for instance. And we know coal is central to this, because they are going back to coal. When we look at South Africa, again, we are told to end coal. Now, clearly, this example alone would tell us that there is hypocrisy in more ways than one. And also at the same time, looking at a country like South Africa, and where we were, where we've come from, and where we intend going. At this point in time, Cyril Ramaphosa obviously will be leading South Africa into the BRICS summit. These are some key issues. These are some critical issues that our president needs to address.
Yes, certainly, Inayet. Energy is the number one issue every nation and region is facing as we speak. Energy inflation is at an all-time high, and even before the war, South Africa has been in a period of systematic and regular shutdowns of the energy system, load shedding as we call it, and it's being the new normal. But when you unpack the issue is that what is fundamental is that energy is the central input into the economy, without which there is no economy as you and I will understand it. There would be no movement of goods from agriculture to warehousing to ports, and so energy is basically the central input for the entire economy, both upstream and downstream. Now, what it suggests is that, again, coming back to our planet, we have only one planet, and it's a finite planet, Earth, and the demands for the population as you move towards urbanization and larger population growth is every citizen on the planet needs to have energy, needs to have access to food, to transport, to education, to housing, to water, sanitization, etc. And that would mean a pressure on the system. So within the energy policy, again, the UN was quite clear. The United Nations system, the IPCC, we call it COP26, that took place in the UK last year. Where the contradiction comes in, or as you correctly said, the hypocrisy, the EU nations and the US pushed South Africa, especially, and a few other countries, to sign an agreement to end coal. And yet coal is the number one resource in our country. We have 80 to 90 years of coal in our geology and mining reserves. And by doing that, again, in a paternalistic way, without considering our own national interest, that is now filtering down into our state-owned enterprises, especially Eskom, which is actually mismanaged in the very same way as it was during the previous administration. So there's very little difference in terms of the governance logic between the previous administration and the current. And we see it playing out in the media over the last few days and weeks. It shows that when your energy system does not provide for your population and you have the reserves, other countries, like the Europeans are doing now, despite they pushing and signing the Conference of Parties, the COP26 climate change agreement, they sponsored it, they signed on it. And a few months later, they are putting in amendments that state, look, the EU and Germany is now going back to coal. And this is the same Germany that you have the Green Party that's in the ruling coalition. And yet the EU, in their funding and in their approach to South Africa, are telling us to stop coal, and we have the coal. So this is the kind of issue that talks about the neoliberal, neo-colonial approach of yesteryear. And we thought with democracy we overcame that. And again, it's up to our leadership to show that they are sovereign. And I think every nation under the UN Charter has the right to sovereignty, to economic policy. And there's even something called the UN right to development. It's enshrined in the UN Charters. The UN Sustainable Development Goals. To put all of that together, many nations have those rights or space to determine their own pathways. China has taken that and ran with it, and they're successful. They haven't ended coal. what they have done, they've invested in technologies, and today they have what is called clean coal technologies, and they are the world leaders in clean coal. In the last 3 or 4 years, they have invested in 23 new mega clean coal technology plants, and it's generating like 10 gigawatts of energy into the grid. So they look at their nation, the industrial pathway, they look at the environment, they look at the climate impacts, the air quality, and they apply all the technologies that they have, and they continuing on the providing economic growth and development for their population. So there's nothing stops South Africa from doing the same, except that we've become, our leadership especially, have become very dependent on especially consultants from northern countries, technocrats from institutions like the World Bank. They've been sitting in our institutions for 20, 25 years, and they continuously churn out the same kind of rhetoric that is not moving with the times. Even a country like Egypt is beating South Africa. Nations like Rwanda, Tanzania, Angola, Zambia are actually, at an energy policy level, are actually more advanced than South Africa, which is quite sobering for us. And what have they done? They have taken their own policy and their own economic interests, and they put it first. We one of the only few countries in the world that is slavishly following this model, and that is quite diabolical. But again, it speaks to the paucity of leadership, the lack of leadership, the lack of an integrated approach. And when you do not take your economic policy or your energy policy sovereignty seriously, then other nations will take those resources at a very cheap rate, and will leave local populations pauperized. And I think we are moving towards an inflection point where citizens are now really at, I mean, I would say even middle classes in South Africa are so overstretched. The vast layer of the middle class in South Africa is now completely in debt. And, many cannot even afford basic food basket, clothing, and fuel costs for at the end of each month. And so we're seeing deepening inequalities, and all of this is leading to all sorts of social protests, crime going up, all kinds of movements emerging. And this is a symptom of a deeper structural problem that since the COVID pandemic, we've had a country, this administration has received 500 billion rand from the IMF over 2 years, and most of that was squandered in corruption. And today there's no money for fuel subsidies. The road accident fund cannot reduce it by 2 rand, for instance, a litre. And so we're sitting with a country and an administration that has no regard, or very little regard, for its own population. This is the reality we face.
I think we've got about 5 minutes to go, actually, and obviously we're going to get onto the next program at 8 p.m. Nixon, I'm going to give you about 2 minutes, Nixon, just some final thoughts and just looking ahead at the conference that is starting tomorrow in 2 minutes. What do you expect?
I think one, I expect for the BRICS country to consolidate their approach to world economy and really come up with the in terms of world economy, but also coming up with a clear policy direction on how the BRICS countries can come together in moving away from this Bretton Woods institutions and the broader approach by Western countries, but also kind of calling for the liberalization of a World Trade Organization, which has come up with different policies that seeks actually to kind of muzzle the development of developing countries. And I think that is the most important aspect of this meeting, if there is any discussion on economic front. On the security front, though, I think we know for the fact that China is at a loggerhead with the United States in the South China Sea, where China is facing a threat from the United States. The United States were deploying its vessels there, whereas China trying to have a control over the issue in Taiwan. On the other hand, Russia also, but the issues of energy security, as Ashraf said, I think those are critical issues that are going to come out of this meeting. And if the BRICS country can come up with a coherent policy on these issues, I think it will be a right move in the right direction.
Ashraf, just final thoughts, 2 minutes with you.
Yes, thank you. I agree with Nixon that it offers a lot of hope and a broader scope for developing nations. There will be, in my view, some agreements around the reform of multilateral institutions. There will be more injection of capital in the new development bank for development programs. There will be more focus on sustainable peace and security in many parts of the world. I think they will also be looking into the World Trade Organization outcomes and how BRICS nations can inject more developmental content into those outcomes. And finally, I think the other platform is on partnerships around the digital economy, around science and technology and innovation, as well as for many African nations, affordable access to important technologies. And by that, I mean agricultural technologies is a big theme. And China is going to invest a lot in agricultural technologies, in vaccine technologies, make it more widely available, as well as quality infrastructure, etc. So I think there is phenomenal opportunity. And look, South Africa is in a very weak position economically, and the current trajectory of the current administration, especially under President Ramaphosa, who's looked to the G7 in the last 2 or 3 years, and it has shown no results. In fact, I think by looking to the G7, especially during the COVID period, and literally begging the G7 for vaccines and not getting it, he has lost a lot of credibility and very little developmental impact for South Africa. And President Ramaphosa is in a very weak position politically as well. And he has very little choice but to go now with the BRICS nations and hopefully find a better deal in that domain. Because frankly, he's done everything the EU said, he's done everything the G7 said, and we have gotten no developmental impacts. So he is in for a difficult period, but hopefully he can change trajectory and try and broaden his developmental approach and diversify it into the global south, because the future of the planet is in the global south. The north has literally, through colonization, destroyed much of the world, and hopefully the new era or the new civilization will emerge in nations of the south, including Africa. So we are in.
Well, Ashraf, we thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, we thank you for that. And also, Nixon, thank you very much for your time with us this evening here on Salam Media. And, well, let us see what actually comes out of the BRICS Summit 2022. But for now, all the best to both of you. Once again, appreciate your time. All the best.
Thank you.
Yes, that brings us to the end of part one of tonight's edition of Wednesday Night with myself, Inayet Wadee, on the up-and-coming BRICS Summit, which is taking place tomorrow and on a Friday, the 23rd and the 24th of June. We certainly will follow developments and see what comes out of it, particularly looking at where Russia is at this point in time, as far as its involvement in the Ukraine goes, and also at the same time, the other major players like India and China, and where does South Africa position itself, being a member of BRICS. The time is just gone 2 minutes past 8. We are going to go for a break. We come back and part 2 of tonight's panel discussion focusing on Israeli-India relationships.